basically this judicial reform or judicial or constitutional coup, its aim was to strengthen the executive branch, which is already quite strong in Israel, but it wanted to strengthen it further and to politicize, for example, the election of judges. And then after you politicize the election of judges, it's also easier to pass on laws that are not democratic in their nature.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. I have the pleasure to host in ELIAMEP's series of podcasts Gallia Lindenstrauss, a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and editor of the Institute's journal Strategic Assessment. Gallia, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join you.
Well, Israel's security environment is deteriorating. Since the start of April, Israel has found itself facing a multi-front increase in security threats that reflect also the deterioration in Israeli-Palestinian relations over the past year. What has triggered this, in your opinion? What has happened in this last year that has made things again worse in Israel?
Yes, well, Israel has continuous challenges in the security realm. And in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian arena, unfortunately, we haven't been able to solve our differences with the Palestinians. And hence, also in the previous government, we already saw a beginning of the deterioration. But with this new government, which is is considered the most extreme right government Israel ever had in its history, then everything this government does is even perceived worse than if another government would have done that. So there were several steps that were perceived negatively by the Palestinians. And we also see, yes, that there's also growing Iranian efforts to see a more united front against Israel. So in this past Ramadan, which would basically, if you look at it in retrospect, people worried it would be much worse. So in retrospect, it wasn't that bad. But in Ramadan, yes, we saw that Israel had multiple fronts and could have developed to a multi-front war. Luckily, we're not there.
Well, we had the impression that after the Abraham Accords, that is the series of agreements that normalize relations between Israel and several Arab states, that things would get better, even in the Palestinian front. That is not so. Is that correct? Now, with the government of Netanyahu, we see in foreign policy that he gets also a cold shoulder from the United States and also from Israel's allies in the Arab world. Does that have anything to do also with who Mr. Netanyahu is, you think, who this government is?
Yes, basically, yes. The idea with the Abraham Accords was that Israel would repair its relations with Arab countries, and this would in turn later on bring a better relationship also between Israel and the Palestinians. This currently has not worked in its two elements. One, the Abraham Accords was not expanded. There were not really more significant countries that joined along. We're still in the initial countries that signed the agreements. That was one problem. The other problem, yes, that this government was seen as I mentioned, as more extreme, and anything it does is also interpreted as something that is not conducive to Israeli-Palestinian relations. So this has made it harder for the original Arab Abraham Accords countries to continue the momentum, and there was a chilling effect on Israel's relations with this country. If you add to that the fact that the current government in Israel also has some problems with the Biden administration, this does affect Israel's image. It seems that Israel is weakening. And if you add to that, of course, the internal protest in Israel, then this image of Israel weakening is having its effect also in Israel's foreign relations.
Well, we may say a lot of things about Israel. We may criticize Israel for many things, but not for its democratic values. Until now, Gaia. Is that going to change because there are concerns about the harm to democracy from the judicial overhaul that the government of Netanyahu tried to put forward? Then it was stopped by the strong civil society. Is democracy in Israel in danger?
So Israel had seen before this internal crisis, there was also a political crisis. We had 5 elections in less than 4 years. and that, of course, created a lot of instability. Part of the reason for this instabilities were the corruption charges against Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's a court case against him, and hence some parties are not willing to have him as Prime Minister, and this sort of created it gave more power to the extreme left and the extreme right in Israel's political system. It weakened the center because the center could not agree that Netanyahu would be prime minister. So, following the last election, in which, first of all, the center left did a miscalculation and got less parliament seats than it could have. And second of all, there's also a feeling of less personal safety in Israel. So there was a call for strong people to do law and order, and hence there was more votes for the right. And so Netanyahu did manage to form a government after this last election, but it was the most, as I already mentioned, it was the most extreme right government Israel ever had. And this government, quite early on, decided that it would promote what they called the judicial reform, but what the opposition calls basically a constitutional coup, a change of Israel's regime to what the opposition sees as non-democratic. And basically, this judicial reform or judicial or a constitutional coup, its aim was to strengthen the executive branch, which is already quite strong in Israel, but it wanted to strengthen it further and to politicize, for example, the election of judges. And then after you politicize the election of judges, it's also easier to pass on laws that are not democratic in their nature. And this raised a lot of concern about among center-left Israelis, and they went to the streets. So we're now talking about more than 4 months of a protest movement. It managed to make the government stop temporarily this judicial reform, but it's basically the legislation is already ready. So they can, in 24 hours, put it again on the table of the parliament and move it ahead. So there's a lot of concern in the protest movement to keep to be alert and not to stop until this government promises that it will not move ahead with the constitutional reform. We're currently stuck in this moment in the sense that the protest movement has proven stronger than the government expected. But on the other hand, the government is also proven quite insistent that it will move ahead with the constitutional reform. So we're in sort of deadlock, and we'll see how Israel gets out of it. I hope, because some of the issues that are being discussed are very fundamental issues in how Israel should continue its existence and identity issues. That actually these were issues we shied away from discussion for many years, and we let things deteriorate. I hope that this very frank discussion that is now taking place in Israel will, after we get out of this crisis, we will get out stronger. And with regard to democracy, I think that Israel, because it's so much based on knowledge, in the sense that both its military advantage and its economy is so much based on a knowledge economy. It can't afford to be non-democratic, because these people, there will be a brain drain, and all this dependence on knowledge will evaporate. So I think in order to survive in the future, Israel has to be democratic, and I hope we will get out of this crisis strengthened.
Are you worried that with this government, with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and the relations with the Palestinians so tense now, that these regional tensions will increase and become also cross-border with Syria and Lebanon because of the new Israeli government's policy stance?
I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a lingering problem that Israel has not been able to solve. There was a major break after the second Intifada in the 2000s, in which many Israelis felt that this meant that there was no solution to this conflict, and it had to be managed. There's no way to solve it, just manage it. And since then, there has been a drift to the right in the Israeli public opinion. And Netanyahu, as of course, is a right-wing leader, but he has been in the past a very cautious leader. During his years, actually, Israel avoided wars, and he's known that he is very cautious in going out to war. The question is whether his coalition partners will make him go in a certain direction that is dangerous to stability. And also, is he the same leader that we knew from before, or he has changed because of this court case against him and the fact that he feels that his future is dependent on changes to Israel legal system. And that's on the side of the Israelis. Of course, also Israel's enemies are also preparing and looking at Israel, and they perhaps also have a false impression that Israel military strength has weakened. I think this is not the case. I think Israel's military is still strong and can still answer military threats in a very forceful manner. But this combination between internal weakness in Israel and the perception that Israel is weakening, this perception among outside actors that Israel weakening is dangerous to stability. I agree with you.
Well, we know that Israel has good relations with Russia. How do you think that the war in Ukraine and Russian war against Ukraine has affected the relations of Israel, also with the member states of the EU, of course, the United States, but also Turkey? I'm going to talk also about the relations of Israel with Turkey. I read recently in an opinion article in Jerusalem Post that Turkey and Israel have managed to salvage their relationship. Do you think that is so? And that has to do also with the diplomacy of the earthquake, like it happened with Greece and Turkey relations?
Yes, so these are two questions. One with regard to Israel's position on the war of Ukraine. Of course, the war in Ukraine requires everyone to decide where they sit. And Israel, in the past, it was very clear that Israel is in the Western camp. But following Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war, Russia and Israel formed closer working relations, and a lot of what Israel does in Syria is at least coordinated with Russia to the fact that the Russian planes will not be affected by Israel's actions in Syria, and this is, and Israel wants to maintain its freedom of maneuver in Syria, and this has been a cause for Israel hesitancy to be completely outspoken against Russia's actions in Ukraine. Although Israel has said, of course, it condemns this attack and that it is in favor of course, maintaining Ukraine's full sovereignty. That's one issue. Another issue is the Jewish population in Russia, which is significant, and this is also a cause of concern of how Russia might negatively treat the Jews in Russia if Israel is too much vocal in favor of Ukraine. So this was basically the situation in the beginning of the war. What has changed is now that Russia has much more closer relations with Iran because of the war in Ukraine, and that is a cause of concern in Israel. So I think there will be probably somewhat a change of stance of Israel with regard to the war in Ukraine. With regard to relations with Turkey, so as part of Turkey's attempts to normalize relations with different countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, even Syria, Turkey also approached Israel to normalize relations, and this has been successful in the sense that the ambassadors have been brought back to Ankara and Tel Aviv. They were not in place since 2018, and in 2022 they were reinstated. Now, this was the backdrop of the earthquake, that there was already ambassadors back to Tel Aviv and Ankara. There was goodwill that was resulted from this normalization. But of course, yes, the earthquake, like Greece, Israel responded quickly and sent a very respectable rescue mission, and also medical staff to Turkey. And this was appreciated, just, I guess, as you said, just like it was greatly appreciated that the Greek help to Turkey. And yes, so this is a good momentum, but we know that, I mean, this is the current situation, but we should be also skeptic that this will necessarily continue in the future, because we know Netanyahu and Erdogan have had their rhetorical battles, and Erdogan has been very critical with regard to Israel. So at the moment, we're in a good period in Turkish-Israeli relations, in terms of atmosphere at least. But whether this will continue, this is an open question. And in general, Israel-Turkey relations are very far from where they were in the 1990s. The only really strong point currently going on with Turkey and Israel is the economic relations. Here, definitely, the bilateral trade is very impressive. We have an $8 billion mutual trade. Most of it is Turkey's exports to Israel.
What is your opinion about the elections in Turkey, Galia? Do you believe that Turkey's foreign policy and its stance towards the West will change if Erdogan loses the elections and Kılıçdaroğlu is the winner? Or there will be no significant changes after all, and that's what we hear now is only the pre-election rhetoric?
So the first question, I think, is whether Erdogan will accept defeat. It's actually hard to imagine him leaving power in a peaceful manner. So that's one question mark. But even if the opposition does govern Turkey, Erdogan is living a difficult legacy in the sense that the economic situation is dire. The government is probably hiding the real scope of the economic crisis. Currently, it's doing all sorts of populist economic measures to ease the economic burden of the fact that there's hyperinflation and the devaluation of the Turkish lira. But after the elections are over, these populist measures will no longer be in place, and hence the burden on Turkish citizens will be heavier. So that's one difficult legacy Erdogan is leaving. The other issue is, of course, the recovery from the earthquake. The reconstruction costs are enormous. There are 1.5 million people that don't have houses in Turkey and need new houses to be built. There are, of course, Turkish construction companies that are able to do this in practice, but you need the funding, you need the money, and that's also a difficult legacy. And lastly, I would say that from the Israeli experience, that before this government, we had this anti-Netanyahu government that was a very broad coalition of different parties with very different ideologies, and it was very hard to manage this change government in Israel. It managed to hold into power only 1 year. I think in the Turkish case also the opposition currently unites against Erdogan, but if and after they gain power, they will have hard time to function in terms of their ideological differences, and that's a source of concern. Now, how all of this will affect foreign policy, clearly there will be some more goodwill towards Turkey in the West if there will be if it will seem that the opposition won and there was a peaceful transition of power, it would seem like Turkey's back to a more democratic path, and that would be appreciated in the West, especially in the context of this war in Ukraine, in which it feels that also democracy is in threat. But after the first few months in which there will be better atmosphere, the old problems will likely return. The fact that the EU accession process is basically not going to materialize in Turkey joining the EU at the end of the end of the tunnel. Also, of course, within the Eastern Mediterranean, the opposition, some of its nationalistic parts and even the more center parts, I think, are united in quite hawkish views on the Eastern Mediterranean. And with regard to the Middle East, I think here there's also quite a consensus that there is need for sustaining these new normalized relations with the United Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and also Syria. And in a way, the opposition actually, Erdogan is doing what the opposition thought he should have done already before the election. So there will be a continuation on this element. With regard to the US, that's an interesting question because anti-Americanism has become quite widespread also in Turkey. So Biden had a personal issue also with Erdogan. He almost didn't speak to him on the phone. He didn't invite him. So maybe if there's a change of leader, there will be also more opening of the space for better US-Turkey relations.
Do you see also a change in Greek-Turkish relations? After the elections, Greece has elections, Turkey has elections. Do you see that this momentum of better understanding each other that came after the earthquake in Turkey may lead us to have a better understanding of each other and not being always at the throat of each other and with this rhetoric, war kind rhetoric?
Here, of course, you're more experts than myself, but echoing some insight I got in the Delphi Economic Forum I just participated in. It's clear that there's a better atmosphere between Turkey and Greece, and atmosphere does matter. And the atmosphere creates a good place where you can advance relations. But you also need substance. You also need to translate this atmosphere into concrete steps to improve relations. And here, some people in the Delphi Forum were skeptic, and it does seem that despite the fact that Turkey and Greece have discussed the issues, for example, of the delimitation of the EEZs, they have discussed these issues. In a way, there seems to be still many roadblocks in solving this issue, and also, of course, the Cyprus question: how do you solve that? The only thing we can say is that it seems that the countries in the region, at least Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, will be over the election cycle very soon. I mean, Cyprus already had elections, and Turkey and Greece are having the elections very soon. And getting out of the election cycle, sometimes in the first year after election cycle, you can promote things that are difficult to promote later on, when elections are closer. And so I would say there's good atmosphere. There's needs to translate it to concrete steps very soon, or else we'll lose the momentum of the good environment.
Gallia, thank you very much for finding the time to have this discussion with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the attention.
This was another Eliamep podcast with Odin Linardatou. Recording, editing, and sound editing by Petros Karpathiou. Follow us on the Eliamep channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and elsewhere.